3,000 years ago, the Lord gave Solomon a task that his father David had been judged unworthy to carry out, the building of a temple. When it was finished, Solomon's temple was the wonder of the world. But in time, Israel grew weak and was subdued, first by Egypt, then Babylon. And as the centuries passed, the temple was sacked, desecrated, and ceased to exist. In the 5th century BC, it was rebuilt, but again fell victim to time and neglect. Then it was the turn of Herod I, who reconstructed the very house of the Lord, Beth Elohim, in which Christ worshipped his Father and scolded those who took it for granted or used it selfishly. Now, at the crossroads of 2 more centuries, strong feelings are evoked by this scene, the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, part of the substructure of Herod's temple, which was completely destroyed in the Roman conquest of 70 AD. About this temple, Christ prophesied, "There shall not be left one stone upon another," and there is not. All that remains is a retaining wall beneath the original temple site, which remains a sacred spot for Judaism and Christianity. From even before the dawn of history, human beings have felt a need to set aside special places to honor their deepest feelings and fears about the meaning of life and death, however primitive those feelings might be. In the ancient pre-Christian world, this instinct gave birth to artistic forms that survive to this day. And yet, unlike the Wailing Wall, constructions such as the Sphinx and pyramids long ago ceased to be places of worship. Columns and pedestals like these in Greece are shadows cast by lights of a former time. The worshiping communities have vanished. The pagan beliefs that shaped not only a style in architecture, but an age of man, are now swept away like the winds and tides these monuments once stood for. And yet the temple endures, Beth Elohim, not in ruins, but with abiding stability and power. Many temples in the remotest corners of the earth, again manifesting sacred ordinances and sheltering the closest communion between the Lord and his holy priesthood. This program is about 5 of those temples, ones that have been raised up to God in the farthest reaches of the vast Pacific Ocean. In time and space, they are a world removed from the first temple in Jerusalem and from the site of the restoration of temple worship on the American continent. But because of faith, determination, patience, and hard work, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ is being preached virtually everywhere in Polynesia today, and the sacred work of the temple is being accomplished in Tahiti, Samoa, Tonga, New Zealand, and Hawaii. In a moment, we'll begin visiting all of those places, meeting local church members along with elders and sisters who have come here from abroad. But to understand and truly appreciate this Polynesian story, it's best to begin at the actual beginning. The Book of Mormon relates that the Lord preached to the Nephites in their temples on what is now called the American continent following his resurrection. The Nephite civilization came to an end about 300 years after the destruction of Herod's temple in Jerusalem. And so from that time onward, through centuries of growth and conflict among various Christian denominations, temple worship in its original spirit and form disappeared from the world, and for more than a millennium was forgotten by mankind. In the year 1820 AD, in North America, in the state of New York, a youngster named Joseph Smith received a divine manifestation while at prayer. There were further revelations in the coming decade, while the first of the Latter-day Saints, amid almost constant persecution, began to gather around this extraordinary young man who clearly was a prophet of God. And then on the first day of June 1833, the Lord appeared again and directed his prophet to build a temple in which he, God Almighty, would once again endow his chosen servants with special authority and power. Despite the continuing persecutions and other severe hardships, in 3 years' time the labor was done, and the first temple of modern times was dedicated at Kirtland, Ohio. The persecutions intensified, and before the end of 2 years, the saints were forced to flee, leaving behind what had been built with such great sacrifice. The migration was westerly, first to Missouri, then to Illinois. At Nauvoo, Illinois, in January of 1841, the voice of God was heard again, calling for a new house of worship, one in which even more blessings than those given at Kirtland would be bestowed. The work began almost immediately and pressed onward despite harassment and constant financial strain, even after the martyrdom of the prophet, and despite the certain knowledge that the saints would have to flee again, as indeed they did. On April 30th, 1846, during the final days of the Exodus, the temple was dedicated, and then once more what faith and obedience had built had to be left behind. In 1848, a fire destroyed the interior. 2 years later, a tornado demolished the walls, and by mid-century, nothing was left of the temple at Nauvoo. But new temples rose up to God in the western Zion: St. George, Logan, Manti, and on April 6, 1893, the majestic temple at Salt Lake was dedicated. Gordon B. Hinckley of the First Presidency spoke of these sacred buildings which have been built both in times of security and relentless persecution, in poverty and prosperity. Here, he said, we set aside our own selfishness and serve for those who cannot serve themselves. Here, under the true priesthood power of God, we are bound together in the most sacred of all human relationships, as husbands and wives, as children and parents, as families under a ceiling that time cannot destroy and death cannot disrupt. Briefly, this has been the background of our faraway story in Polynesia, a background literally of biblical proportions. In comparison, one might think the founding of a few remote temples here and there in the Pacific Ocean would be a much smaller story and one of mostly local interest. But as we're about to find out, nothing could be further from the truth. The next temple to be built after St. George, Logan, Manti, and Salt Lake was on the remotest land in all the world, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, a land called Hawaii. The firmament that the church's newest temple would stand upon had burst from the sea about 3 million years earlier, one of 7 major land bodies in a string of isles and atolls stretching from mid-Pacific almost to the Aleutians. In a way, the birth of Hawaii had been a kind of recreation, obedient to those powerful opening lines of Genesis, in which waters divide from waters to become dry land, while the new earth produces vegetation and seed-bearing herbs. Waters and skies teem with living creatures, and the Lord God at the end of each day finds it all good. In geological time, it wasn't until almost yesterday that human beings appeared here. Historians believe the first Hawaiians were seafarers from Tahiti and the Marquesas, who came upon Hawaii sometime around the 7th or 8th century AD. Their society was tightly organized by priests and nobles, and bound by a rigid system of taboos that served to placate various gods, ruling over nearly every aspect of life and death. 1,000 years after Hawaii was discovered, it was discovered again by the English explorer Captain James Cook, who arrived during harvest time and was welcomed as the god of agriculture. Cook immediately named the islands after the first Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich. Other Europeans and then Americans followed in Cook's wake, and by the early 1800s, the first in a steady migration of Calvinist missionaries sailing from Massachusetts began finding their way round the Horn to the Sandwich Islands. They built clapboard churches with conical steeples after the fashion of New England, and then set about the work of converting the native population. The missionaries were spectacularly successful. Before the 1820s expired, the old deities had fallen, and many Hawaiians were eagerly adopting the ways of the haole, the foreigner, especially in matters of religion. By 1839, the native language had been given written form, and the entire Bible was translated into Hawaiian. The story of the first Mormon presence in Hawaii begins far from these Pacific shores, back on the mainland in the rugged outback of California's gold rush country. Here, a group of prospector missionaries sent by President Brigham Young were in search of ways to strengthen the young Zion financially. In September of 1850, 10 of those gold miners received new orders from Salt Lake to pull up stakes, head across the ocean, and begin to preach the restored gospel in the Sandwich Islands. Among the group was George Q. Cannon, who later was to serve in the first presidency of the church. In mid-November, the missionaries sailed from San Francisco, steerage class, aboard the Imam of Muscat, arriving in Honolulu on December 12th. Next morning, they hiked up to Kings Falls in the Nu'uanu Valley, bathed for the first time in a month, and held a special service of prayers and hymns, asking God's blessing on this new venture. Kenneth Baldridge, professor of history at BYU Hawaii and longtime resident of the 50th state, comments about those times.
The success of the early missionaries seemed to be due to the fact that they began teaching the Hawaiian people rather than the Haoles. The 1854 group had a young 15-year-old lad by the name of Joseph F. Smith, who was the nephew of the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, and he was to exercise considerable influence because he later became president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
The missionaries divided up and went off to preach in the principal islands, Kauai, Oahu, Molokai, Maui, and the Big Island, Hawaii. What they taught seemed puzzling to natives who were already calling themselves Christians. For now they were being asked to accept not only the divinity of Christ, but a new revelation and a new authority handed down by a contemporary American prophet. And so the story was told for the first time again, how a 14-year-old youth on a farm in upstate New York was deeply moved one day while reading scripture, how he went to a nearby forest and beheld the divine Father and Son and received instructions not to join any of the existing churches because all had fallen into apostasy. How 3 years later the heavenly messenger Moroni revealed the location of ancient metal plates engraved with the record of the Nephites and the laws of the new dispensation. Now in the 19th century, after more than a year of setbacks and discouragements, the teaching took hold and began to bear fruit in these islands. By the fall of 1854, the saints in Hawaii numbered more than 3,000. But trouble was on the horizon. Converts who had hurried into the church soon fell by the wayside. Then a smallpox epidemic took many lives, especially on Oahu. Tensions over the approaching Utah War drew a number of missionaries back to the mainland, and an ill-fated experiment in creating a local Zion on the small and then desolate island of Lanai proved costly to the saints, even in terms of morale. In February of '58, the order came from Salt Lake: close the mission. What followed was the still controversial chapter in Hawaiian and church history involving the flamboyant figure of Walter Murray Gibson, a convert who appeared on the scene after the mission closed and assumed control of what remained of the LDS community. 3 years later, in 1864, he was excommunicated, charged, among other things, with using church resources for his own aggrandizement and profit. Afterward, Gibson continued his career outside the church in Hawaiian politics. This is the northeast shore of the island of Oahu today. It is the focal point in the modern history of Polynesia, because a fresh beginning for the church in Hawaii was launched in 1864 when 24-year-old Joseph F. Smith, nephew of the prophet, was named president of the newly established mission. It was young Smith's idea to find a new gathering place for the saints, something on a more solid footing and better organized than the failed experiment on Lanai had been. And so in time, after much negotiation and sacrifice, a 6,000-acre plantation called Laie was purchased on credit for $14,000. Within a few short years after the deal was struck, this land, purchased at $2.33 an acre, would become the center of Zion in the Pacific. And more than half a century later, as president of the church, Smith would see to it that Hawaii would have a temple. Samuel Lowe, an official of the Hawaii mission today, looks back at those formative days.
In the year of 1915, Joseph F. Smith, who was now the prophet of the church, came to the islands, and he came for a business trip. And after a meeting here in Laie, he walked up to this particular area where you see the temple site with Elder Smoot. And when they reached this temple site, he was inspired by Heavenly Father to say to Elder Smoot that this is where the temple will be built.
Since the purchase of Laie, the history of the church in Hawaii has been marked by three major accomplishments: a temple, a university, and a cultural center representing all of Polynesia. Of these, the temple is the crowning achievement. For almost 4 decades, from its dedication in 1919 until a temple was built in New Zealand, this house of God served the scattered islands of the Pacific. It has been the spiritual center and gathering place for a vast part of the earth with many diverse cultures and languages. Victor B. Jex, president of Hawaii's temple, believes there is a direct connection between this temple and the missionary zeal of Joseph F. Smith.
So this is the 5th temple after they left Nauvoo of the church. And I really think the reason it happened so early was because of the special feeling that Joseph F. Smith had for the Polynesians.
Hawaii's temple is a serene, dignified presence designed by Hiram Pope and Harold Burton, the same architects who designed the temple in Alberta, Canada. Crushed lava was used as an aggregate in making concrete. Literally, the temple is made of the same materials as Hawaii itself. The beautiful friezes adorning the upper walls were created by Leo and Avard Fairbanks, whose sculpture tells the story of salvation through the restored gospel. Because Hawaii attracts so many vacationers from abroad, the Visitors Center here has enjoyed a unique contact with a cross-section of people from outside the church, as well as those within. Missionary Michelle Dushku has been a part of this daily process of reaching out, meeting people, and explaining.
For many people, they want to know more about the Book of Mormon. And there's others who want to know how we feel about families, and we tell them more about the temple itself and how families can be together forever.
In matters of education, some of Hawaii's very first schools were founded by LDS missionaries. The most far-reaching effort of all was launched by the first presidency in 1954. A college would be established in Hawaii. The following September, the Church College of Hawaii, CCH, opened its doors as a 2-year institution to 153 students and 20 faculty members. By 1974, when the name was changed to BYU Hawaii, it had become a 4-year college with an enrollment of 2,000. The idea for the Polynesian Cultural Center, now one of Hawaii's top touring attractions, began as an idea of Elder Matthew Cowley's back in 1951 when he was head of the church's Asian and Pacific missions. He suggested that Maori natives from New Zealand could offset the high cost of their living in Hawaii if they got together and made cultural and entertainment shows, charging admission. The idea took root, and in less than a decade had become a much larger entertainment and educational concept. In 1960, a special performance of Hawaiian, Samoan, Tongan, Fijian, and Maori dancers was held in Waikiki to rave reviews. The net result today is the Polynesian Cultural Center in the heart of Laie, where more than half the employees are students of BYU Hawaii. The original purpose has been achieved. The two institutions support each other. Almost a century and a half have passed since George Q. Cannon and his fellow missionaries arrived on these shores and went in search of the new Latter-day Saints on Oahu, Maui, Kauai, Molokai, and the Big Island. The faith and dedication of those first missionaries still energize the church in Hawaii today. Literally an American church abroad in its own territory, one populated by many races, and still very much a mission. The men who disembarked from the Imam of Muscat in December 1850 must be proud of the outcome of things, and especially proud of this, the first temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints built across the seas. South and east across the equator, 4,400 miles from Honolulu, is a land of contrasts, startlingly different than Hawaii. Here, the winter sun moves across the northern sky, and trees change their color to autumn in May. The native Maoris call this Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. The rest of the world calls it New Zealand. Glaciers and fjords, woodlands and primeval rainforests, pastures and mountain lakes, and uncountable snow-capped summits, scenes that don't agree at all with the popular image of Polynesia. But as a human habitat, the islands comprising the land of the long white cloud belong very much with those other isles scattered to the east and north, because all of their peoples have common ancestors. Many historians teach that the ancestors of the Polynesians began migrating from Southeast Asia around 1000 BC. But there is also evidence of a westerly movement across the Pacific. In any case, New Zealand was the last major land to be reached and populated, most likely by explorers sailing not west from Asia, but east from Tonga and Samoa, which had already been settled. That was about 1,000 years ago. The first European encounter with New Zealand occurred in 1642, when the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman made a brief stopover, then sailed away. More than a century passed before the indomitable Captain Cook happened upon the scene. He was more thorough, circumnavigating the islands and claiming them for England. What followed was the same seaborne incursion of Americans and Europeans that descended on Hawaii, whalers mainly, and seal hunters and soldiers of fortune. And as in the case of Hawaii, Protestant and Catholic missionaries sailed in the wake of explorers and entrepreneurs. The land that the missionaries found was both strange and familiar. To all appearances, they'd sailed most of the way around the world, only to land again in the British Isles or New England. But the people, the native Maoris, that was another story. The Maoris were sometimes aggressive, owing a fierce loyalty to their individual tribes. So complete was tribal identity that Maoris had little concept of nationhood or common culture. In the early 1800s came the first of the Protestant missionaries, Samuel Marsden, who'd been known as the flogging parson because of his penchant for discipline. Meantime, the Maoris, in abandoning the old gods, also adopted the white man's weapons. The native population fell dramatically on account of warfare and ailments including venereal disease brought by the foreigners. In the 1860s, a Maori leader, King Tawhihao, was heard to predict that someday ministers would arrive from over the seas, traveling in pairs and speaking the language of the people. 20 years later, the king's vision was realized in the form of LDS missionaries, moving about the countryside 2 by 2, speaking to the people in Maori. In 1882, a powerful chief named Hirani Fahanga was converted to the church, and soon the Maoris were accepting the restored gospel in great numbers. Many were moved by the Book of Mormon account of the ancient explorer Hagoth and his followers, who set out into the West Sea in large boats filled with supplies, only to disappear. Throughout Polynesia, there is the parallel story of Tiki, who likewise sailed with colonizing people to the various islands. By 1887, there were nearly 2,600 church members. 80% were Maoris. Today, the saints in New Zealand number over 76,000, and this island nation beneath the equator has become a beacon for the church in the South Pacific. And here is the outward symbol of that light, the temple, the 11th to be built since the temple in St. George was dedicated in 1877. John Sonnenberg, the temple president, says the native Maori people have been the root of the church in New Zealand.
Of the first 1,000 converts that were made in the early days of the church in 1881 and 82, when the first wave of strength was evident, it was among the Maori people, and 90% of them were Maori people.
Best known among the missionaries who served in New Zealand was Elder Matthew Cowley, who was later ordained as an apostle of the church. Cowley first came to this country as a 17-year-old missionary. Through the efforts of Elder Cowley and many others, the saints found a gathering place for themselves in the beautiful Waikato Valley on New Zealand's North Island. In the late 1940s, the church approved construction of a secondary school here, which today is a much expanded institution with residence facilities and other meeting places for the saints. And the ethnic makeup of the church today? Roger Hammond, a longtime member, says times are changing.
It would be perhaps just a little bit more than 50-50 now. The church, it had been sort of said that the church was a Maori church by a lot of the Europeans, but that doesn't hold anymore.
The temple has played its own role in diversifying the membership. Its commanding presence on a hill tends to draw visitors from the nearby highway, and the visitor center itself, with the power and serenity of its Christus statue, all have given welcome to those who are curious about the church and the faith, and from such curiosity, conversions have grown. The story of this temple itself is inspiring. how it was constructed by labor missionaries on a sacred Maori sanctuary, how Elder Wendell B. Mendenhall originally hoped this would be the location, and how President David O. McKay, without knowing Elder Mendenhall's hopes, looked at the site and said, "This will be the place for the temple." Decades later, it can be said that the church has fully arrived in New Zealand.
It has a bright future, a very bright future. We have to watch our step like everybody else does, that we don't get complacent and that sort of thing and take it for granted. But the church in New Zealand has a firm hold, and it is in very healthy condition. Not only that, the people of the country are very tolerant and understanding and take us as one of their own and not an oddity anymore.
For many years, the voice of Rangi Parata Parker has been instantly recognizable in New Zealand and Australia. Now retired from an active show business career, this well-known Latter-day Saint sings about her faith, her Maori blood, and her native land.
When I'm feeling a bit down during the day, I can put our music on and listen. And if I'm missing any of my family, I feel a lot closer to them. And music, apart from the church and my family, is my life.
It's a land of beauty. Wherever you go, you'll see the beauty of the greenery. The grass is so lush and green that it's amazing that one country should be blessed so abundantly. It's a land that's just a little island surrounded by water on all sides, and it looks like it's almost been preserved by the hand of the Lord with all of its beauties. Its flowers grow, its crops are abundant. There are various parts which are known as the food basket of New Zealand, and they grow a harvest that's literally second to none in the world. And yet, some of the neighboring islands are similarly blessed, like Tonga and Samoa. And we have a lot of Tongans and Samoans that come here and tell of the same success that they have in their islands, like we have here in New Zealand. But New Zealand is a land of beauty. If you were to wake up early in the morning and see the sunrise and the beauty of the sun coming up on the horizon, and then seeing the settling of a long white cloud over this beautiful valley, you'll know why it was called the land of the long white cloud.
In the spring of 1980, the First Presidency announced that 7 new temples would be built around the world. Less than 3 years later, 3 of those new houses of God were dedicated in the South Pacific, in Tonga, Samoa, and Tahiti. Geographers refer to this huge part of the world as Oceania, which is the sum total of its volcanic and coral islands, reefs, and atolls, and other land masses. Its nickname is the Liquid Continent. Tonga is not a single island, but at least 150 islands just below the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. Only a few dozen are inhabited. It was in these waters that William Bligh, skipper of the HMS Bounty, was cast adrift in an open boat by mutinous crew members. Cannibalism was practiced in Tonga, as it was among the Maoris of New Zealand, until after the first missionaries began to make conversions. Tonga's move from tribalism to democracy took a giant stride during the long reign of King Taufa Ahau Tupou I, who died in 1893 at the age of 96. Today, King Tupou IV presides over a constitutional monarchy, and from his 19th century Victorian palace helps to manage a peaceful, friendly nation of more than 100,000 citizens who were in the process of being discovered by the 20th century. Tourism is gaining a foothold, though many visitors, especially those who come back often, would like to keep Tonga a secret from the rest of the world. Meantime, the main source of national income continues to grow on hundreds of thousands of palm trees, ending up as coconut oil or copra for export. These special islands leave a lasting impression on visitors. They are a kaleidoscope of impressions. Tonga is the first South Pacific nation to set aside coastal reefs as national parks. They are a refuge for more than 100 species of tropical fish, and humpback whales are often seen off Tongan shores, migrating to and from the cooler waters of the North Pacific. The only land animal native to Tonga is a curious creature called the flying fox, which isn't a fox at all, but a variety of bat. On western Tongatapu Island, they can be seen at daylight hours, snoozing upside down in trees, or stretching their 3-foot wings in flight. For Latter-day Saints, the going in Tonga hasn't always been easy. In the early years, there were tensions with other churches, and in the 1920s, relationships with the government were strained as more and more people converted. Today, in a nation whose population is around 108,000, well over 30,000 are LDS. Approximately 1 out of every 3 Tongans is Mormon. Brother Norman Harris, the temple recorder, says these islands have a special sense of dedication about the church and the temple, which has been their reward.
Prior to having the temple here in Tonga, they used to travel outside of the countries, especially to New Zealand. And used to be a real hardship, saving all of what they had and selling just about everything they had to go down to the temple in New Zealand. And having the temple here right at their back door, so to speak, is a real blessing to them. And this is the crown factor of all of their hard work and sacrifices that they have put into the church.
This scene of students coming home from school illustrates the religious picture in Tonga today. The different uniforms representing the different church-run schools. There's the Methodist Free Church of Tonga, the Free Wesleyans, the Church of England, Roman Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, and Mormon. This LDS high school on the main island of Tongatapu symbolizes the achievement through perseverance that the church has taught and practiced in these islands since the first missionaries arrived shortly before the turn of the century.
What's the formula for hydrochloric acid?
Sione Vimahi is the principal of Liahona High School.
The majority of our teachers here are graduates of BYU Hawaii. And most of our teachers here are local teachers, are Tongans. In Tonga, we are very grateful for the church because the church provides this opportunity for us. So the government is educating the elite, while the church educates anyone who passes their minimum requirements.
The straightforwardness and character of Tonga's young people is something that deeply touches missionaries from abroad. Elder David Larson and Sister Doris Larson are education missionaries here.
Let me tell about an experience. At 6:30 in the morning, 2 Tongan boys had gone down behind our home and they had climbed the coconut tree and they had gotten some coconuts and they were on their way back to their dorm. And the one boy who in a deep Tongan voice, and their singing is beautiful. They have beautiful singing and deep bass voice. If you could get a picture of their singing in a choir singing, you would be impressed. But this boy came and they were singing he was just singing at the top of his voice, I need thee every hour. And he was just singing all the way as he walked across the campus. What a wonderful way to start a day.
Anthropologists theorize that Tonga, and probably also its neighbor Samoa, were the cradle of Polynesian culture, that all the other islands were discovered and populated from this base after Tonga itself was found by those mysterious prehistoric ancestors. Unexplained by current scientific theory is why the kumala, a variety of sweet potato, is found here and in South America, but not Asia, and why the legend explaining the origins of Tongan royalty is remarkably similar to that of the Incas of Peru. These coincidences, which tend to support the teachings of the church, have been among many factors helping the local missionary effort. The Latter-day Saints are growing in Tonga, in 10 staks and over 100 wards, and in the temple, which opened its doors in September 1983. Probably no one knows this island, its people, and its temple better than Patrick Dalton, the temple president, whose Tongan experiences date from his missionary days 30 years ago.
The people in Tonga are absolutely the best people in the world. They're lovely, they're friendly. By knowing and working with the Tongan people, you very quickly understand why Captain Cook called them the Friendly Islands. But I have learned a lot working in the temple, and now I know that there is nothing in this world that's more important than for us to convert the unconverted to Christianity, to the church, to prepare them, to make the saints worthy, to get them to the temple where we can unite families for eternity, from generation to generation.
West of Tahiti and south of Hawaii, there's a long, warm stretch of ocean with 16 islands. They are the two groups of Samoas, American in the east, and in the west, the independent nation of Western Samoa. Our story is in the west, on the island of Upolu, where the 24th temple of the church was dedicated on the 5th of August, 1983. Unlike Tonga, Samoa is high and lush, gifted with water and profuse vegetation. Its climate is hotter and typically tropical, and most of its volcanic islands are ringed with reefs and lagoons. Western Samoa, which has been independent for more than 30 years, has been described as a living museum of old life traditions reaching back through the centuries. Its people are the second largest group of Polynesians on Earth after the Maoris, and nearly everyone here is full-blooded Samoan. In the year 1920, the LDS population numbered about 3,500. In May of that year, President David O. McKay paid a visit, after which conversions increased dramatically. Today, the saints in Samoa account for about 25% of the population. Tropical storms have played a key role in shaping the history of modern Samoa and of the church as well. Even in 1992, the cleanup continued in the aftermath of Hurricane Val, which hammered Samoa relentlessly in 1989. The second major storm to strike the island in less than 2 years. Elder Ed Bishop, Director of Temporal Affairs for the Samoan Mission, lived through Val.
Well, I'd lived through a lot of blizzards in Western Canada and things like that, and so I was used to storms. This one sounded like a freight train bearing down on you all the time. The noise for the full 5 days was, after a while, it just kind of became oppressive to you, that it was the roar of the winds and things like this, and you kept hoping that each hour that the storm would begin to move away.
But this hurricane would also generate some spiritual side effects, because the immediate and well-organized LDS response and relief efforts caused thousands of non-members to take a closer look at the church.
The church has gained, I think, in stature because of the things that we have done. And I attend, I'm a member of the National Disaster Council and attend the meetings with the other government officials and things like this. And it's good to be involved and to see just how much of a contribution we have made, and to have the government acknowledge, as they say, they're our Mormon friends and what they've done for us.
2 years after Val, there was still ample evidence of the storm in various reconstruction projects and in the stumps of once beautiful shade trees that lined the harbor area, and in the countless decapitated palms on all the islands. But life goes on. As Elder Bishop says, these islanders are a sturdy lot.
There is a great resilience in the Samoan people. I don't know that you could go anywhere else in the world and find a people that could go through what they have gone through and come back as quickly as they did.
Some unusual historical events surround the creation of modern Samoa, and they have a German connection. Relics of that history are still seen along the harbor road in Apia. They are reminders that Germany was a colonial power in Samoa from the mid-1800s until the outbreak of World War I. Earlier, political tensions brought warships here. The stone markers commemorate the loss of many lives in 1889 when a hurricane sank a number of those vessels in the harbor. The Latter-day Saints also have an unusual history in Samoa. The first two missionaries were sent from Hawaii in 1863 by the unauthorized leader, Walter Murray Gibson. For 20 years, they labored without church support until the mission was reorganized before the turn of the century. Today, with a dozen stakes, over 50,000 members, and a temple, the church in the two Samoas is very healthy indeed. As President Price says, the most important things happen when their time is ripe.
I asked for a temple when I was mission president here 25 years ago. And the brethren didn't think the people were ready for a temple yet. And they're probably right. But when they did put a temple here, I wasn't invited, but I came anyway for the dedication of the temple, and it was a great experience. I bumped into lots of people that I knew, and they were thrilled to death that a temple was here in their own backyard now.
Thankfully, the hurricane of '89 left the temple relatively unscathed. Most at risk, of course, was the statue of Moroni, alone in the wind. But as Elder Bishop says, the last survivor of the Nephites also weathered the storm.
Moroni shone through the whole thing, and they were able to keep the lights on the generator going at that time. And so he was kind of a beacon to all of us to keep going.
For missionaries and casual visitors alike, Samoa leaves lasting memories, pictures of people and exuberant colors in the public marketplace, in the spectacle of painted buses lumbering through the crowded main streets, in the curious sights along the country roadsides, and in the wide-open Samoan homes known as follies. Over the years, many missionaries have paid their respects to the author Robert Louis Stevenson, who during his last years lived in this house in western Samoa. Here he died, and his tomb, high above the ocean on Mount Vaea, is inscribed with his own epitaph. "Glad did I live and gladly die," he wrote. "Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill." Our final stopover in this South Seas tour of LDS missions is roughly halfway between Australia and Peru. It was here that the most recent temple dedication on a Pacific island took place, October 1983, as President Gordon B. Hinckley formally opened the temple at Papeete, Tahiti, on the western fringe of French Polynesia. Papeete is no longer the sleepy village that once welcomed sailing schooners and early Protestant missionaries. Today, it's a city of about 100,000 people, and the streets can be clogged with cars, motor scooters, bikes, and buses, depending on the time of day. In fact, the pace of life in some neighborhoods can rival that of Paris. Since 1842, Tahiti has been flying the tricolor of France, along with the rest of the Society Islands and the Marquesas. Like their Hawaiian cousins, the natives of Tahiti were at first spellbound by their European discoverers and the Americans who followed. And like the Hawaiians, they easily abandoned their ancient gods to embrace the religion of Protestant and Catholic missionaries. But for the first Latter-day Saints in Tahiti, in fact, the first in the whole South Pacific, the work of conversions proved much more difficult. It was a far-reaching decision that the prophet Joseph Smith made in 1843 to send 4 men to proselytize in the Pacific Islands. Elders Benjamin Grouard, Addison Pratt, Noah Rogers, and Knowlton Hanks left in April of that year and sailed east around the Cape of Good Hope. Elder Hanks died and was buried at sea. Records left by these and later pioneers of the church show that the first missionary work was done on the island of Tubai, 350 miles south of Tahiti, and then to the east in the Tuamotu group. But the going was difficult on Tahiti itself. And in 1852, the government restrictions led to the mission being closed. And by the time it reopened, most of the early converts had fallen away. What a different picture now, a century later. 11,000 saints in 2 stakes and 18 wards. And as a blessing for faithful attenders, a temple. President Ralph J. Richards knows what a change this house of God has made in many lives.
The people used to go clear to New Zealand about once a year for a month, all go on a plane, sell everything they owned in order to get the tickets to go, and never expected to get there again.
The cornerstone for Tahiti's temple was laid in December of 1983 by President Hinckley, who recalled the early work and sacrifice of those missionaries sent by the prophet. The completed temple, with its gleaming blue tile roof, brought praise not only from church members who attended the dedication, but from officials of the French provincial government who were also on hand. The growth of the church in Tahiti has been relatively slow but steady over the years. In the 1980s, however, there was an upturn. Temple President Richards has an explanation.
It's made a difference to have the chapels all around the island. We have about 12 chapels, and that gives us some dignity. You know, before we were just a bunch of boys wandering around trying to convert people, and when they were converted, there was nowhere for them to go very much. But gradually, these other buildings have been built. About the last 5 years, they've put up most of them around the islands, and so we have a good name here, and are well liked by the people, and we get along very well with them.
In some ways, the missionary challenge of Tahiti is very different than that of other countries. To begin with, 2 languages must be learned, French and Tahitian. This is not true of Tonga, Samoa, New Zealand, or Hawaii, where English is a second, if not the first language of potential converts. Temple matron Miriam Richards has her own good-natured solution to this problem.
They can understand me enough of my language, and if they don't understand, then I take them by the hand and go show them what I want them to do, and it's just working out beautifully. They're a loving people, a very loving people.
Tahiti. Hundreds of missionaries have served on this spectacular island and have carried away permanent memories of its people and ocean vistas. It has many glorious reminders of creation, and also now and then of human vanities and weaknesses. Somehow in Tahiti, these various images coexist and remain in the mind for a lifetime. In less than an hour, we've crossed 3,000 years of time, from the day of Solomon to the day of Christ, to the day of the restoration of his gospel, to this day, and to the present moment. At this moment, the truth is being preached in the most remote corners of the world, not only on the great continents, but on the distant Pacific islands we have seen. This program is dedicated to all those, past and present, whose work has merited the temples of Polynesia.